Hi, my name is Elisa, and I'm a technical support analyst on the VertiGIS Studio team. In this tech tip video, we'll be taking a broad look at some of the authoring aids you have at your disposal in VertiGIS Studio Workflow Designer. Getting used to new software can feel like a giant hurdle if you're unfamiliar with the way it works. So this video is meant to highlight some of the tools that VertiGIS Studio Workflow Designer offers to make your job a bit easier. Before we dive in, be sure to watch our Getting Started with VertiGIS Studio Workflow video for a ton of useful information on the basics. An important thing when you're building your workflows is to keep them organized. This helps you and others navigate your workflow and understand what's happening. A useful tool for this is the container activity. As you can see, it essentially just acts as a holder for other activities and allows you to group things in a way that makes sense. We can name this container initialization. Let's also give it a brief description so it's clear what is being initialized. Inside it, let's put a Get Workflow Inputs activity. This activity is very important because it allows you to pass arguments into your workflow. A key example is if you want to pass context from a VertiGIS Studio web app. Let's say we've selected a bunch of features in VertiGIS Studio Web and want to pass them to our workflow. We'll add the workflow to the Feature Actions menu in the web app. When we run it, you can see that the Get Workflow Inputs activity gives us a list of VertiGIS features inside a context object. If viewing the workflow inputs and outputs using the browser console like this is unfamiliar to you, be sure to check out our video on how to debug your workflows. Pulling in features from a VertiGIS Studio web app brings up another tip when working with workflows. Objects come in different types. You can usually check the inputs and outputs of an activity to see the object type. For example, the getLayer activity might have a string or a number as its input, and output a layer object from Esri's API. Aside from simple types like strings, numbers, and Boolean values, the objects you will typically encounter are from Esri's API. These are things like features, layers, geometries, and portal information. However, when it comes to our Get Workflow Inputs activity that grabs VertiGIS features directly from the app context, the object type is not going to be the same as features from Esri's API because VertiGIS Studio Web stores feature information in a different way. To make things a bit easier to work with, we want to convert them to Esri graphics objects. We can do this with an operation in VertiGIS Studio Web called results.toGraphics. We can find information on this operation in the API section of our Developer Center. It says, one of the accepted inputs is a list of features, and the output is a list of Esri graphics. So, in our workflow, we will add a run operation activity. We will set the operation name to results.toGraphics and set the operation parameter, in other words, the operations input, to the features from the Get Workflow Inputs activity. To indicate that the text we are entering is an expression and not a string, we want to start with an equals sign. Now, there are a couple ways we can easily reference an activity's output. One way is to select the desired activity, then click on the question mark icon next to the desired output and click the copy button. We can then paste this into our input. Another way that tends to be a bit quicker is to start with a $sign and either scroll through the drop-down list to find the right activity or start typing the activity ID to narrow down the suggestions. Once we have that, we specify that we want the context object within it. Notice that we don't get a suggestion for the context object. Since it's coming from outside the workflow, Workflow Designer doesn't know that it exists. We have to determine the correct path to the object using the breadcrumbs in the browser console. On the flip side, if you had a situation where you wanted to pass Esri features directly into VertiGIS Studio Web, like if you wanted to use the highlights.add command to spotlight features from a query layer activity without showing them in your app's results components, you would need to convert them from Esri graphics objects to VertiGIS features. To do this, you would use the results.fromGraphics operation. But the operation parameter would look a bit different from the results.toGraphics operation. According to the Developer Center, this operation can take multiple input arguments, which means they need to be written in JavaScript object notation, or JSON for short. This looks like curly braces with a bunch of comma-separated key-value pairs inside. The results.fromGraphics operation requires a graphics key, and the value is our list of Esri features from the query layer activity. There are a couple other activities whose main purpose is to help organize things, like the notes and placeholder activities. The notes activity allows you to leave comments on your workflow. In this case, maybe we want to mention that the getWorkflowInputs activity grabs VertiGIS features from the app so that they can be converted to Esri graphics using the results.toGraphics operation. We can even use Markdown syntax to add a hyperlink to the developer documentation on the operation. The placeholder activity can be used to show the flow of logic. In this case, let's say we want to exit the workflow if the list of features is empty. We would first add an if activity to check the contents of the list. A good logical expression for this might be to see whether the length property of the list equals 0. Let's add a description that says, check selected features. Now, we can add a placeholder activity on the true side of the if activity and change its display name to something like no selected features. Then add an exit activity. The placeholder helps clarify why we are exiting the workflow so that it's not necessary to pick through the if activity's expression to figure it out. Now, many of the activities we have in here don't exactly belong in an initialization container. Let's delete the query layer activity. To do so, we can hover over it and click the Context menu button. There are many options in here that are useful for authoring workflows, but we will just select the delete option. Alternatively, you can use the delete button on your keyboard. Let's also move some of these activities outside the container using copy-paste. To select multiple activities, press and hold the Control button on your keyboard while you click each activity, or click and drag a selection box. Then, we can right-click on the activities and select Cut. Outside the container, we can right-click again and select Paste. You can also use the typical Ctrl-X, Ctrl-C, and Ctrl-V keyboard shortcuts to do this. Now, let's say I didn't like what I just did. I could click the Undo button or Ctrl-Z on my keyboard to revert back to the previous state. It's important to note that the undo functionality is context-dependent, so its behavior will change depending on where you are in your workflow and what you have selected. Back in our container, let's add a create value activity to the false side of the if activity. If you're familiar with coding, create value activities are kind of like defining variables. They allow you to assign a value to a unique ID. Let's initialize this value as an empty list by putting an equal sign and 2 square brackets. We will also give it a more descriptive ID. To do so, we click the Edit button next to the current ID. Let's call it Object ID List. When working with JavaScript, it's customary to use something called camel case, which means that the first letter of the variable name is lowercase, and the first letter of each subsequent word in the variable name is capitalized. Now let's try running the workflow again. When we check the browser console, we'll notice that the workflow stops at the Get Layer activity. This is because the rest of the activities are not connected. Workflow follows the direction of the arrows, so disconnected activities will be ignored when the workflow is run. Now, let's cut and paste this section back out to the main area. Notice that the activity ID we created earlier is preserved. This is because we used the cut option. If we had used the copy option, the activity ID would have changed to prevent duplicate IDs from being created. This is important to remember so you don't end up referencing the wrong activities. Pasting this section put it off to the side, so let's move it to the center and connect it. To make things look a little nicer, we can use automatic alignment. Let's select the activities we want aligned, then right-click and choose Align Center. Alternatively, we could use the Space Evenly option for a similar effect that also sets an equal distance between the activities. Another useful tool in workflows is iteration. This allows you to execute the same operations repeatedly over a list of inputs or over a specified number of loops. To test this out, let's add a for each activity. We will use it to iterate over the Esri features coming from the results.toGraphics operation we added earlier, and create a list of object IDs. For this, we will need to add an add item activity inside the loop. We will set the collection to the empty list we initialized earlier using the create value activity. Since we are looping through a list of features, the item object of the for each activity will be a feature. Now, we want the attributes property of the Esri feature, and we specifically want the object ID attribute. To see whether this worked, we can add a log activity and set it to output the contents of the object ID list to the browser console. Now, let's run the workflow. As expected, we get a list of numbers corresponding to the object IDs of the features. However, let's say we didn't get the output we expected. Perhaps we had a typo in one of our activity inputs. We could pinpoint the problem using the workflow navigation tools. In the bottom left, you can see that there is 1 problem, 0 warnings, and 0 information messages. If we expand the Problems tool, we can see more details. It looks like the Add Item activity doesn't like the reference to the For Each activity. Checking the For Each activity's ID, we can see that it is For Each 1. If we click on the error message, it will bring us to the Add Item activity. The item input is highlighted in red, and we can see that the activity reference says For Each instead of For Each 1. Fixing this resolves the problem. There's also a navigator tool to help you find activities in complex workflows, as well as navigation options in the context menu of each activity. Finally, there are a few overarching concepts that are helpful to know. First of all, if you have installed VertiGIS Studio Workflow on premises, you have the option of creating either a server-side workflow or a client-side workflow. Client-side workflows are the typical workflows a user would interact with in your app, while server-side workflows can execute tasks on the server itself, like writing files or querying a SQL database. It's worth noting that server-side workflows are not available in the SaaS version of VertiGIS Studio Workflow since it is cloud-based. Secondly, workflows are modular, meaning you can reuse your work for various different purposes. One example of this is to compartmentalize your workflow into sub-workflows. Each subworkflow is a self-contained unit that executes a certain set of tasks. This means that if you need to run the same set of tasks at various points within the same workflow, you can simply run the subworkflow instead of having to reconfigure the activities each time. Lastly, it is important to share your workflows with the appropriate audiences so that your users can run them. You may be familiar with checking the sharing permissions in VertiGIS Studio Web Designer, but you can also access this information using Workflow Designer. To do so, click the Info tab in the left toolbar and click the View hyperlink under the workflow URL. Please note that you need to have saved your workflow before you see this option. This will link to ArcGIS Online or Portal, where you can modify the sharing settings to match the target audience. That wraps up our workflow tips and tricks tech tip video. We covered a great deal of information, but hopefully you have a better idea of how you can use the authoring aids in Workflow Designer to simplify your workflow building experience. For detailed information on the topics mentioned in this video, please see our other tech tip videos or visit our documentation center.